With the release of God of War Ragnarok, it looks like we've wrapped up the Norse mythology section of the franchise in just 2 games, whereas the Greek side had its 3 mainline titles, with 3 more prequels wedged in between, and a mobile game that are all considered canon to the franchise. There's also a couple different comic series and a novelization somewhere in there too that may or may not count as canon, depending on who you ask. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to focus on the mainline games. That's God of War 1, 2, and 3, God of War 2018, which is basically God of War 4, and God of War Ragnarok, which is then God of War 5. I'm going to be mostly staying away from Ascension, Chains of Olympus, and Ghost of Sparta. From a gameplay perspective, you're not missing out on much if you played the mainline trilogy compared to these. Storyline-wise, they are pretty divisive among fans. Some think they're full of plot holes, and some think they're well-told stories that expand on Kratos' character. Like most things God of War, I feel like the truth is somewhere in between. There's big character progression moments, like watching Kratos be reunited with Calliope, just to realize he's being tricked, then has to abandon her, and expanding on his relationship with Deimos. But there's also stuff where playing God of War 1 feels weird, when they keep talking about no mortal being able to best a god, when they later retcon in that Kratos technically now already killed Hades' wife Persephone, who's a god. But Kratos also did that with the help of Zeus and Helios, and I doubt that Persephone is much of a threat as Ares was in combat. But then that also makes it weird again when Hades helps Kratos in God of War 1, but later brings up how he hasn't forgotten about what Kratos did to his wife when they fight in God of War 3. But you could say that Hades helps him in God of War 1 because Zeus commanded him to, and getting Ares out of the picture was the bigger issue. Not to mention that Kratos' demeanor is kind of off in the prequels compared to his more melancholy tone in Part 1. But you can also say that's just a change in his personality over the years of being around gods and dealing with his past. See how I'm just running in circles already here, and it's a minute into an hour-and-a-half video? You can argue it either way, and neither is wrong. So yeah, those games have their ups and downs, and a lot of it is kinda open to player interpretation on whether it's good writing, or just plot conveniences and retcons because Sony wanted to sell more PSPs. It's just a huge issue with almost any prequel-style story. So, to make everything more streamlined, yeah, those games will come up once or twice, but it's just way easier to stick with the mainline titles for the majority of this video. If you couldn't tell already, full spoilers for all the God of War games. Now when you think of which franchises have the most games in their library, God of War is still being dwarfed by long-running heavy hitters like Mario, Sonic, Call of Duty, Pokemon, and Zelda. But those games aren't exactly big on the storyline or character development. They focus mostly on the gameplay. Other major long-running series like Metal Gear, Final Fantasy, Assassin's Creed, and Resident Evil all have the benefit of telling multiple narratives with an interchangeable cast of main characters. God of War is Kratos. Atreus gets his shine in Ragnarok, but at the end of the day, the prophecies are about Kratos leading the armies against Odin, and Kratos being the man worshipped for rebuilding the realms after war. All that Atreus being the champion of the Jotnar, this is your story talk, nah. Ragnarok is still Kratos' story, even if Atreus gets more focused than any other side character has before. I can't really think of another franchise that's been so successful both critically and commercially that's focused on one main character and told one very long-running character arc. Kratos' story arc that started in 2005 with God of War 1 comes full circle 17.5 years and 8 games later with Ragnarok in 2022. And it's an extremely satisfying ending for his character. Or potentially an ending for him, but that's a topic for much later in the video. I think his character development over time is one of the best examples of long-form storytelling in all of gaming. Most of this video is going to be focusing on Kratos and his said character arc throughout the games, but I do want to get into how the gameplay has progressed over the course of the series first, because there's a lot of stuff there that's really interesting to me. When I say looking back on the gameplay is interesting to me, I don't actually mean playing the games, even though they're still great. I mean how people remember playing them. I feel like the Greek God of War games are some of the most misremembered games out there, bordering on a Mandela effect level of forgetting what actually happens. People seem to misremember large parts of both the storytelling and in-game content, definitely myself included too at times. When Ragnarok was released, I thought some of the criticisms of repetitive gameplay and the direction they took Kratos' character were a bit off base. There were even people who gave it really good reviews that mentioned how Kratos feels like a completely different character, the plot feels more like a Marvel or Disney movie by the end, or that the gameplay is just a copy and paste of God of War 2018. Go back and play the original games. People seem to remember them as non-stop hack and slash action, while Kratos was this mindless killing machine, and that just isn't the case at all. Didn't like how the mask thing never got answered? Well, there are definitely some pretty cheesy plot elements and story MacGuffins in the Greek games too. But before I get ahead of myself, let's start with God of War 1 from a gameplay perspective, because this game really lays the groundwork for the entire franchise. This is obviously a very long video, and if this part isn't what you came here looking for, I'll leave a timestamp on screen to skip ahead to where I specifically get into Kratos' character development over the years. The original trilogy absolutely nailed its intro sequences. They did a fantastic job of teaching game mechanics through gameplay and not just with on-screen prompts, even though there are a ton of those too to guide you along. Level design is great, and it's always paired with a huge cinematic set piece behind it. In this case, it's the shipwreck and Hydra fight. Getting used to the fixed camera angle again is a little jarring at first, but it works here. This was kind of the next generation of fixed angles at the time. Most people immediately think of the PS1 old school survival horror games when it comes to that camera style, and this is kind of the updated version of that. Rather than just being static, the camera will move along with Kratos and almost always gives you plenty of room to take in your surroundings and act accordingly. From just a gameplay standpoint, I would argue that God of War 1 has the most variance out of the entire series. Some of it is pretty tedious and not all that fun, but still probably has the most variance. You can tell they made a conscious effort at pacing out the game and making sure nothing felt overused. Combat sections weren't ever that continuous without being broken up somehow. Whether that was with balance beams, puzzles that had to be solved in and out of combat, platforming elements, having different magic attacks and getting the sword, switching to the vertical and horizontal combat sections real quick, and of course, everyone's favorite, the fucking climbing section in the underworld. Playing older games now can be kinda tough because they just handle and control differently than today. Back then, you were used to it because you didn't know any better. Now going back, it can really suck sometimes, and this is a great example. I remember doing this and not thinking twice about it when I was younger, but playing it as an adult made me want to smash the controller. Like, Jesus Christ, I hated this part and got genuinely disappointed when I forgot there was a second pillar to climb too. Whether this is true or not, who knows, but I did see online that this was the only part of the game that wasn't play tested before release, hence the annoying difficulty and horrible hit detection on the blades. But back on topic, they'd even switch up the rooms to nonsense in order to make sure that the player had variance between the encounters. You weren't aware that ancient Greece was known for its rooms full of conveyor belts, meat grinders, and flamethrowers? You're welcome. Now you know. What about finding secret passageways while flaming boulders are continuously raining down on you? Not just in Bowser's Castle anymore, also in Greece. It's out of nowhere, it's ridiculous, but it's fun to play. God of War 1 is the most flat-out video-gamey, for lack of a better term, game of the bunch, and definitely a product of the times, but it holds up pretty well. It's not as crisp or responsive to play as other big title games of the time, like Resident Evil 4 or Metal Gear Solid 3, but it's still a very good one. It was fun to go back and play for the first time in God knows how long. This is where it gets a little funny to me when people complain that Ragnarok is just a big DLC package for God of War 2018. Because there's a ton of stuff in the original trilogy that carries over into the Norse games that people have seemingly forgotten all about. First off, some of Kratos' attack animations have been essentially the same thing for well over a decade, not just across the two newest games. You didn't like relearning the same moves from 2018 into Ragnarok? Kratos was already learning those moves again back on the PS2. There's only so many different attack animations that you can give. Kratos has been using those blades for a long time, and there's only so many different ways that he can swing them. I'm not complaining about this, I'm just saying relearning moves was around in the series long before Ragnarok. In God of War 2, Kratos is tricked and stripped of his powers by Zeus. In 3, he falls into the river Styx, which drains him of his powers, instead of outright killing him. In 2018, he's older, hasn't been fighting as much, and Greek magic doesn't travel outside of Greece. In Ragnarok, a mixture of Fimbulwinter magic along with wear and tear hold him back. As for his straight-up physical attacks, well, Kratos just has a bad memory, and he always has. Once he gets moving again, he remembers which attacks he likes to use. But yeah, I mean, they've always shoehorned something in to depower Kratos at the start of each game. They are still video games that need to be interactive, and the fact that they make a conscious effort at the start to try and explain why you start over is kinda cool. There's a ton of sequels that just tell the player, fuck continuity, you're starting from scratch, and leave it at that. In my video on God of War 2018, I definitely criticized the lack of enemy variants, but that was mainly focused at the repeated troll fights. But if we're talking about common enemies, you're going to fight the same Minotaurs, Gorgons, Chimeras, undead soldiers, Sirens, Satyrs, and Cyclopses across not just the mainline Greek trilogy, but also all three of the prequels too. Hell, you can ride the Cyclops enemies around while they smack smaller enemies, just like you can do to the ogres in the Norse games. For anyone complaining about reused enemies carrying over in the Norse games, from God of War 2018 to Ragnarok is honestly the best game-to-game improvement on enemy variants that we've seen across the entire franchise. The Greek games are extremely heavy-handed when it came to reusing common enemies, and, contrary to popular belief, every boss wasn't a huge spectacle. There were a bunch, but it definitely wasn't every single one of them. It was really only God of War 3 that was able to pull that off. This is where I said there's more of a Mandela effect going on, because substantially more people have played the two newest Norse games than have the older Greek games. Video game sales are always something that's pretty hit and miss. Multiple sources tend to be way off on numbers, and sometimes companies simply never update sales figures once they either hit their monetary budget or don't want people to know a game has underperformed over time. However, it looks like God of War 2018 has been updated several times, and is now recognized as the highest-selling PS4 game, with about 23 million copies sold. Ragnarok sold over 5 million units in its first week, which also broke the PlayStation record for best sales at launch, and has since sold over 11 million copies as of February. Now, depending on where you look, God of War 3 sold anywhere between 5 to 7 million copies. This does get inflated with remasters and such, but at worst, it sold 5 million. Of all the Greek games, this was the highest selling. That means that more people have played just God of War 2018 than have played the entire Greek catalog combined. It also doesn't help that the most popular version of Kratos before 2018 was God of War 3 Kratos, who by this point is basically the equivalent of playing as a villain. Through the mixture of years passing by and differing popularity between games, most people either don't remember Kratos' full story arc, or are simply going off what they saw in a YouTube video titled Kratos' Most Brutal Kills. They're also not remembering how the games were played. Too many slow parts with drawn-out climbing sections, or watching Kratos squeeze between rocks in the Norse games? Well, that's nothing new for the franchise. There's still a bit of that in the original trilogy as well. I knew it was there, but it's a lot more than I had remembered actually. At least in the newer games, we have conversation between the characters while it's going on. In the Greek games, it's just Kratos and the music. Quick side note, the music is still great throughout the whole series. The soundtrack doesn't skip a beat at all going back to the older titles. But back on topic. What about the puzzles between games? Let's start with the Norse series. 2018's puzzles weren't bad, but they did get pretty repetitive in my opinion. There's only so many times I can freeze stuff with the axe just to jump to a platform, or spend time looking at the scenery till I find 3 runic symbols hiding somewhere. Those aren't really puzzles. They're time wasters. It's fun at first, but by the end, I'm kinda over it. Tyr's Temple was cool though. They had the spinning blades to maneuver around, and an actual sliding puzzle you need to solve while the water level rises. That's adding puzzles and gameplay, not just looking for something in the background. That's fun and something you actually engage with. In Ragnarok, I did not enjoy the puzzles. Probably the weakest point of the game for me. It's the most repetitive parts of 2018 being carried over, without the fun switch up here and there where it also interacts with gameplay. I get it. There's going to be carryover from 2018 to Ragnarok. Hell, right now this section of the video is about the gameplay being carried over throughout all the years, but I lost interest this time around in just looking for things to throw the axe at, or using trial and error to get the blades close enough to set off a pink arrow chain. Not to mention your companion now gets in the way sometimes on the timed ones.
Get the fuck out of the way!
But the Greek games weren't exactly stellar in this aspect either. As I said earlier, God of War 1 was a little all over the place. The puzzles themselves were really annoying at times, and not because of design, but because of very strict timers on them. Coupled with outdated controls, it made for a bad time here and there. The one on screen specifically took me like 10 times to get through because of very stiff controls and the no mistakes timer. But playing Tetris around the entire wall is a cool idea. It's not difficult, but it does make you use your brain a little bit. Since you're actively engaging with it and not just mindlessly attempting trial and error, you also don't focus on how slow Kratos is at pushing all these objects around. I do distinctly remember some of these puzzles being criticized for their difficulty back when Part 1 was released. When this came out in 2005, God of War 1 was considered to be a difficult game. As a result, puzzles got toned down a pretty good amount in God of War 2. In Part 2, I felt like I spent just as much time slowly pulling objects around and turning handles as I did playing the rest of the game. Like Ragnarok, they weren't particularly difficult, they just felt more time-consuming than anything else. A lot of times you could tell exactly what you needed to do, it was just screwing around until you figured out the correct pattern. Part 2 was still fun to play, but definitely my least favorite of the Greek trilogy. Oh, and for the record, Kratos getting a spear and being able to use his blades as a grappling hook? Not quite as much of a new feature as you'd think. While they were new going from 2018 to Ragnarok, Kratos gets a spear for a weapon and swings around by his blades in Part 2 as well. So yes, we have seen the Spartan fight with a spear before. Just most people forgot, because it was quite a while ago, and Ragnarok's version of the spear is way better. Notice how I talked a little bit about God of War 1's gameplay and kinda glossed over most of God of War 2? Well, that's because the two look different in their settings, but are basically the same thing gameplay-wise. You can pretty much say the same thing about Chains of Olympus too. People liked God of War 2, it sold really well, got great critic and user scores, but did leave a little bit of a sour taste in some players' mouths for ending on a cliffhanger and not really having much of a storyline. In the first half hour or so, we see Kratos as being a dick and kinda acting like Ares was, so Zeus tricks him and kills him. Then Gaia tells Kratos how to change his fate and get a chance to change the outcome. In the last half hour or so, Kratos returns to fight Zeus, who escapes when Kratos accidentally kills Athena. She then tells Kratos he's a bastard son of Zeus. Kratos recruits the Titans to climb Mount Olympus, and then the end. That's a very abridged version, but it's also a pretty accurate version too. There's not a whole lot left out. You can boil almost any plot down to its bare bones, elevator pitch length description, but you really don't miss anything that important throughout the middle of the game. Part 2 is fun, has bigger and better set pieces, and gave fans more of what they liked, but it was generally seen as a slight step down from the original. Now, that sounds way worse saying it than I mean it. Part 1 was really good. So if Part 2 is a slight step backwards from that, well, that still makes God of War 2 really good as well. With the way the story was told, it just felt like the rug got pulled out from under players a little bit with that ending. Games don't end on cliffhangers, at least not like that. Plenty of games end and set up a possible sequel, but Part 2 felt more like a hard cut in the middle of a scene. When the climax of the game is happening, instead of playing it, we got the ending credits. And that was weird to experience for a lot of people. But goddamn did it work in making everyone really anxious to find out what happens next. This is where Part 3 comes in. The biggest change in the Greek games was definitely going into God of War 3. Moving from the PS2 to the upgraded PS3 technology allowed Santa Monica Studios to make the game significantly more cinematic and over the top than the previous titles. This was something they always wanted to do, but were limited within the hardware at the times. God of War 3 is where we really see every boss fight being this massive spectacle, and see Kratos genuinely being that, fuck it, I'm killing anyone who gets in my way, or really even just pisses him off, style monster that he's known as. And it's a lot of fun. God of War 3 was personally my favorite of the Greek games, and its intro of climbing Mount Olympus with the Titans while also fighting Poseidon is one of the best opening sequences ever in video games. When people think of the Greek God of War games and Kratos as a character, this is what they're thinking of. God of War 3 is such an upgrade in almost every facet that it just overshadows the previous games in the series. Once again, it's a lot of the same elements as the other titles, but the graphical facelift and smoother gameplay really brings it all together here. God of War 3 doesn't really do anything innovative or bring anything new to the franchise, but the production and execution in which it does everything is fantastic. The best way I can explain what I mean with this is in two fights, the ones against Hermes and Kronos. One of the biggest criticisms of the Norse games is the over-reliance on slow climbing sections to get you further in the levels. Half of the boss fight against Hermes is literally chasing him through climbing sections and shimmying around walls. The developers made Hermes so annoying that people forgot about the perceived bad parts of the gameplay because they just wanted to shut that dude up so badly. With Kratos, everyone remembers the big visual spectacle of it that they forgot most of the boss fight is against random minions while riding on Kratos, and not actually against Kratos himself other than a couple QTEs. Every God of War game has some part where I got kinda annoyed or felt like the game just came to a screeching halt. The first two, take your pick of repeated, slow puzzles where you just turn crank handles or slowly move statues around. Not to mention those blade towers in Hades again. Fuck those. God of War 2018 does have some repetitive puzzles and the obvious reliance on the troll fights. With Ragnarok, I get that the Atreus parts are very important to the story, but it just brings actually having fun playing the game to a complete standstill at times. The closest thing like that I can remember having in Part 3 was thinking the controls weren't great when riding harpies. Like, that's it. The pacing, the cinematics, the spectacle of everything, it's just done extremely well and doesn't overstay its welcome at any point. While that also makes it the shortest of the mainline games, God of War 3 doesn't waste any of the player's time. Part 3 does rely a little too heavy on the QuickTime events, though. These were a game mechanic that people loved at first, but little by little grew tired of as the gaming generation went on. Shenmue 1 and 2 really solidified using them as a gameplay feature, but Resident Evil 4 is the game that everyone really associated with the popularization of QTEs with. They were a big part of all the Greek God of War games, and in all fairness are still around in 2018 and Ragnarok, but God of War 3 was where people kinda started to draw the line with them. Part 3 is graphically one of the best looking games on the PlayStation 3, despite being released in the middle of its life cycle, and the later remastered version looks and runs a lot better than other PS4 games. People wanted to take in that new spectacle that came along with those awesome graphics, but it's hard to focus on what's going on in cutscenes and gameplay when you're stuck looking for button prompts around the edges of the screen. It wasn't enough to ruin the game by any means, but it was one little spot players weren't thrilled with. In general, people were starting to tire on QTEs because they were just being overused by a ton of other games around this time frame too. Looking back on it, God of War 3 is a little bit of a weird game to think about. It was the most popular and arguably best game of the series to date. It won a ton of yearly awards and would have won a lot more if it wasn't for Red Dead Redemption 1 being released the same year. No one really had anything negative to say about it, but it was also kinda the straw that broke the camel's back. Gameplay was very fun and the action was over the top, but God of War and Kratos were getting a little stale with players. This game probably has the most in-depth combat and combo systems in the entire series, but it was a little wasted as most players just button mashed their way through it or relied on using the same combos over and over. There's no true good guys or bad guys in God of War 1, but they definitely portrayed Kratos as more sympathetic and Ares as the bad guy. God of War 2 has Kratos being a lot more of a dick, but he also seems a little justified when it's obvious he was nothing but a pawn to the gods. As that game goes on, he slowly gets a little worse here and there until he's just as bad as the gods that he's killing in Part 3. Once people were done playing, and this wasn't everyone by any means, but there were a chunk of fans that didn't really like Kratos' direction. They play up the parts where he feels guilty about his family and tries to save Pandora, but that doesn't stop him from destroying almost all the known world because he's mad. I think it's mostly very well told, but there's a lot of people who felt cheated when there wasn't some type of happy ending, redemption, or even really a resolution to Kratos' story after 4 games, with Chains of Olympus being the other. Kratos didn't just take out Zeus and the gods, he took out everyone in the process, and some people just didn't like that. It went the same way in the opposite direction too. People who didn't care about the whole Kratos just destroyed the known world thing and only cared about having fun playing the game while watching Kratos get his revenge, thought the ending where using the power of hope to beat the gods was kinda lame. For what the series had shown so far, they're not wrong. Kratos using the ever-dangerous weapon of hope to kill gods is kinda out of left field and doesn't quite fit the tone of the series. And it's not just this ending. It turns out Kratos had the power of hope in him since he fought Ares. Does that sound like God of War? People forget this twist when they say Ragnarok gets too sappy. Not to mention that this image of the world is supposed to inspire hope amongst the people who somehow aren't dead. Come on. Greece has been flooded, the sun's blacked out, plant life has died off, and plagues are descending. But you've got hope. Doesn't make a lot of sense in the current narrative. In the real Greek mythology, Pandora's box does contain all the evils of the world as well as hope, but I'm in the camp where this just doesn't translate to the game's ending all that well. The gameplay was still really fun, but it was walking a tightrope of being stale too. Fun or not, how many times can you keep doing the same things in each game? Hell, 2 of the new weapons that Kratos gets were basically reskins of his Blades of Chaos. As I said earlier, the new graphics and smoother gameplay definitely helped mask this, but Santa Monica Studios really hadn't changed much over the course of 4 games in 5 years. Basically, God of War was just getting oversaturated. All of them were really good games, very few people had anything overly negative to say about it, but it was just getting a little played out by the end of Part 3. Fans had just kinda been there, done that by this point. Once people got an ending to the story, an ending that was somewhat divisive, mind you, there was a noticeable dip in the franchise's popularity. These issues would really show themselves with the final 2 releases in the Greek series. Speaking of that oversaturation in the franchise, Ghost of Sparta was released less than 8 months after God of War 3 and did not meet expectations. It still scored well enough with critics and players, but nonetheless was the poorest received God of War game up to that point. It also only sold about 1/3 of the copies that Chains of Olympus did, that one being the other PSP title. This made Ghost of Sparta the lowest selling of the 5 games by over a couple million units. It was more of the same. It was exactly what you'd expect from a God of War game up to this point, and some fans were just tired of that formula and checked out. It even starts very similarly to God of War 1. Kratos is out on a ship, bursts out of the hatch to yell at Athena, and then is attacked by a huge sea creature. It kinda sucks because this game had a lot of potential and does try to open up Kratos' character more, but the combination of the main trilogy being finished, this being on the PSP rather than console, and the repetitive gameplay just wasn't as appealing to people when they already know how Kratos' story ends. However, it would get worse with the release of Ascension in 2013. Ascension would go on to be the lowest rated and second lowest selling game of the franchise. Multiplayer wasn't well received, and the biggest complaint was that, again, it felt like more of the same, except that the stakes didn't feel as high after already playing through the battles against Ares and Zeus. It seems like a weird thing to say now, with the franchise being more popular than ever, but there was a real concern among fans that the God of War name was finished or that it would get run into the ground until that cash cow was completely milked and dead. After the middling reception that Ascension got, even Sony didn't want any more God of War games at that time, and had to be convinced to greenlight the development of the next title. This next game would, of course, be God of War 2018. God of War 2018 was the biggest facelift that the franchise had gotten from a gameplay perspective. For the first time, Kratos didn't start out with his Blades of Chaos, and instead started with the Leviathan Axe or his Shield and Fists. Core combat was relatively unchanged. Everything still revolved around different combos involving light and heavy attacks, with new moves learned through an experience point system. Equipable special attacks that ran off cooldown timers was a nice addition. It was a lot of what players were already familiar with, but had very noticeable differences from the Greek trilogy. Most notably that enemies became much tankier and hits on Kratos hurt a lot more, especially early on in the game before health and armor upgrades were obtained. It wasn't exactly a Soulsborne style combat system, but people were caught off guard by the increased normal difficulty. Kratos' combos and different attacks could get pretty ridiculous in God of War 3, but most people never dabbled in it because you could get by just button mashing and spamming moves unless you were playing on the top difficulties. 2018 kind of forced you into playing the game a certain way. If you just flew into combat scenarios spamming 2 light attacks then a heavy finisher, you weren't going to make it very long. Kratos no longer had a jump attack or the reach advantage from his blades either. You had to get in close and fight shot for shot with enemies who now hit back a lot harder than previous titles. Dodging, parrying, and blocking became much more important, while ranged attacks were managed by controlling Atreus and throwing your axe. Later on, when you do get to start using the Blades of Chaos, they don't have the same force that they did in the Greek games. Before, unless you were fighting a bigger, stronger enemy, Kratos could just wail away at will with his blades. Now mash and quick attack combos will usually get Kratos' attacks broken up by an unblockable attack after a couple hits. With such a large gap between the release of Part 3 in 2018, it all felt like a natural progression to the combat though. The one area that drew the most criticism was with its camera. Previously, it would zoom out and give the player a much bigger field of view. This worked in the Greek games because combat wasn't as tough, and, especially in Part 3, let them show off a lot of the chaos that was going on in the background around Kratos during fights. With the Norse games, combat was a bit more involved. You needed to pay more attention to what you were doing, and you needed to time out those dodges and parries a lot more. You couldn't do this with the camera being as far away as it was at times in the Greek trilogy. This was even a point of contention during the development, as programmers wanted it further back, but director Cory Barlog always envisioned it being closer to Kratos. Personally, I think there had to be a middle ground somewhere, but Santa Monica Studios ultimately decided on this close-range camera for both 2018 and Ragnarok. The biggest change from the Greek games to this was definitely in the storytelling. Kratos had a family again, and his demeanor was more reminiscent of Part 1 than in Part 3. The characters around Kratos also get much more development and screen time. In the Greek trilogy, if you don't include the time it takes to fight them, most of the other characters would be around for a couple minutes tops, and then that's about it. Zeus probably gets the most screen time, but it's not like he has a ton of depth. He's kind of just a generic, I'm in charge and you suck style bad guy. Athena is the only god who appears to have some sort of sympathy or good intentions at times for Kratos, and she's on screen for maybe 15 minutes total between all the Greek games combined. Compare that to God of War 2018. We never even see Thor or Odin, and I feel like they get significantly more screen time dedicated to them than anyone outside of Kratos from the Greek games. While this would almost always be considered a good thing, there were a small pocket group of people that didn't like how this felt more like a modern, cinematic, or Naughty Dog style game than a God of War game. Just like the combat, I think it's natural progression. Santa Monica Studios always wanted God of War to be very cinematic, they just couldn't do it right off the bat. It's not a coincidence that God of War 3 was significantly bigger in its set pieces and spectacle than the PlayStation 2 games. Just like it's no coincidence that 2018 and Ragnarok on the PlayStation 4 are much more cinematic than God of War 3 was. From the gameplay side, the biggest change was the pseudo open world or different hub worlds, whatever you want to call them. The main game is awesome, but I really thought God of War 2018 had some of the best side content ever. Kratos and Atreus would definitely get stronger the more you did, but it never felt like you were breaking the game. You'd get extra dialogue between the two of them, along with Mimir, and it all just felt very fluid. Nothing felt forced, or like something that was added just to pad the game's runtime. Exploring was condensed, but still fun, and not once did I feel like I was playing the usual fetch questing, which is pretty impressive nowadays. There's a lot of games that abuse fetch quests and disguise it as side content. 2018's optional content and main narrative just meshed so well together. 2018 still using a good amount of CTEs did wear a little thin with me though. If I'm playing something like Until Dawn, a Telltale style game, or one of those interactive movie games that are always on the PlayStation Store for like $8, then I'm fine with the QTEs. Those are modern day point and click games, it's how they're made and how they play. When it comes to God of War, I feel like it's unnecessary sometimes. They don't have as many in Ragnarok, but they are still present there too. Some of them you can't even fail. It's basically a pause screen until you hit the prompt. There's a couple of times between 2018 and Ragnarok where I was half rolling my eyes and thinking, just make this a fucking cutscene. It's giving the player an illusion of control when there really isn't any. I'd much rather watch an uninterrupted cutscene instead of having it get all slow and choppy while the game waits for me to hit square twice during an otherwise full cinematic sequence. There are significantly less than the Greek games though, which is a good thing. Going through all the games in a row, and I know I keep saying this, but gameplay feels just like a natural progression over the years. At its core, they really haven't changed a whole lot, but have made enough tweaks to keep it fresh after the original run ran the risk of getting stale. Although I would like to see a return to some of the platforming aspects and real puzzles if they make more games in the future. But if I had to try and predict the future of any potential games, I wouldn't rule out an attempt at an open world God of War game. I wouldn't expect a Rockstar style or Elder Scrolls type open world, but something more along the lines of the Crater from Ragnarok, which I'd be pumped for. I thought the Crater was the most fun part of that game. Run around, fight enemies in the open rather than in hallways with clear battle circles, while solving some puzzles to open up more areas along the way. Yeah, give me more of that. Just bring back the jump button if that's the case. Which gets me to the biggest topic, and that's Kratos himself. He's a character that has far more nuance than I think gets credit for. At the conclusion of the Greek trilogy, he definitely devolves into that monster and god killer that he's referenced as in the Norse games, but he wasn't always like that. That was a Kratos who was at the end of his rope, acting a way he thought he had to in order to achieve his goal of taking down Zeus. A goal he only had because he felt like everything else had been taken from him. We don't get a ton of lore on how the average person lived in the Greek games, but it seems like a pretty rough life for most people, and Kratos is the product of those surroundings. Growing up as a Spartan was no easy task, and essentially made him a killing machine from birth. It was adapt to that violent lifestyle or be killed off and forgotten about. In this world, being a Spartan man was the definition of survival of the fittest, and Kratos wasn't just another average soldier. He quickly became a captain and amassed a sizable army. The game literally tells us that he was a brutal man who everyone except his wife feared. Kratos loved his family, but he loved being a Spartan more. Caring for his family was basically the only redeeming quality that Kratos has when he believed himself to be just a mortal Spartan fighter. He was a warlord whose main concern was growing his army and territory by any means necessary. They even show us a cutscene of his wife asking when enough will be enough, and Kratos pretty much says it won't be enough until Sparta takes over complete control. His biggest concern and want in life was glory from battle. With what we get from his backstory, you could make a pretty good argument that God of War 1 Kratos, who was already powered up and fighting in the service of the gods, was a more compassionate person than Kratos the true mortal. Kratos didn't learn regret or remorse until after his pact with Ares and the death of his family. A pact that he made because losing in battle was so unacceptable to him that he offered his soul to Ares in exchange for victory. That's the kind of mindset that Kratos had at the time. Years later in Ragnarok, we get an awesome quote from Kratos where he says this:
"No, death can have me when it burns me."
In the present day of the timeline, Kratos accepts that his death will happen one day. He's not worried or scared of dying, but he is worried about leaving Atreus behind. This is a stark contrast to the Greek games where Kratos was hell-bent on staying alive for his own personal ambitions. Literally hell couldn't hold him back. At first, those ambitions were to keep fighting as a Spartan, and then it turns to exacting his revenge against Ares and Zeus, who he eventually blames for everything. With that, let's start from the beginning of God of War 1. This is a version of Kratos that we really never see again for the rest of the franchise. He's more melancholy and depressed than angry here. Kratos is still grieving over the death of his family years later. Everything he's doing because he believes the gods will take away his memories of that night if he maintains his service to them. The memories of all his other atrocities don't seem to bother him at this point, as he still believes that's just what Spartans do. They fight, they win, and his actions in battle are just the way things are. This is when Kratos didn't hate all the gods, only Ares, who he blames for the attack against his family. The night his family was killed, he swore revenge, but also knows that there's not really anything he can do to hurt Ares. That is until Ares kinda messes up and starts attacking Athens. Zeus has rules in place where no gods can wage war with each other, but Ares decides to attack Athens anyway. This is the opportunity that Kratos has been waiting for. Tasked with killing Ares, but also getting help from the other gods along the way. And that's an important aspect. The other gods show support to Kratos, and in return, he shows them respect, even saying Lord before their names when addressing them. Right now, Kratos believes that their intentions are genuine. Throughout the Greek games, Kratos kills innocent people all the time, but here he kills a soldier rather than saving him, under the justification that the gods require sacrifice. This isn't as much about Kratos needing a reason to kill an innocent person, but the fact that Kratos still acknowledges the will of the gods. In Part 1, Kratos believes in and trusts the other Olympians. He knows that their power is real, and he's even been gifted small parts of it. He currently has no reason to doubt them, and really doesn't have much of a choice. He knows he can't deny their request if he wants to remove the memories of becoming the Ghost of Sparta. However, he doesn't really anticipate any kind of deceit from the other gods, though. They chose him over one of their own in Ares. It gives Kratos a sense of confidence in both himself and the gods. During the final confrontation with Ares, Kratos even says, "I still have allies in Olympus," before the end of the fight. There is one big thing with the backstory in Part 1, though. As I said earlier, Ares is definitely painted as the bad guy of the game. Kratos isn't a saint by any means, but does get the sympathy points as the lesser of two evils. When they have the flashbacks of what happened to Kratos' family, it's a little open to interpretation who's truly to blame. Seeing as how the murder of his family is arguably the single biggest story beat of Kratos' character, it seems a little weird they never got overly specific on how it happened. They make it clear that Ares was attacking cities and being a dick. Kratos was serving him and leading some of those attacks too. Ares fully intended to take Kratos' family out of the equation by moving them to a city that he commanded Kratos to pillage. The question is, was Kratos in his right mindset when he did it? Ares wasn't completely playing Puppet Master, but it seems like he did have some sort of hand in Kratos' increased viciousness after their agreement. Part 1 shows Kratos hesitate and even get a warning from the town's oracle to not enter the temple. When he goes in, he just starts swinging away at anything and everything inside. Did he expect his family to be there? Of course not. That part's on Ares, but the question is, how much of the blame rests on Kratos too? Even before the agreement with Ares, the game tells us Kratos was an extremely brutal warrior. There's a reason Ares answered his call and saw Kratos as someone that could be of use. I feel like they never really give us an answer on if Kratos had the opportunity to hold back his attack if he had managed to actually take in his surroundings. In Ragnarok, Kratos says that Ares tricked him, but even all those years later in the Norse games, Kratos still isn't exactly known to take full responsibility for his own actions. Ares definitely put his family in harm's way, but Kratos is still the one who pulled the trigger. Kratos was there with an entire army. Ares fully expected his family to die in the assault, but we don't really know if Ares set it up for Kratos himself to be the one to do it, or if that was just a coincidence of the plan. We might never get a definitive answer on which scenario happened. Anyway, throughout God of War 1, we see a pretty calm version of Kratos for the most part. He gets angry at Athena after the intro when he demands the gods hold up their end of the bargain. He yells out about Ares after his family is killed, and he gets mad for a second when the Oracle sees his past. That's about it in terms of the Kratos that fans are used to seeing. On the other side, he has normal conversations with Zeus disguised as the Gravedigger, the other gods who offer him power-ups, and tries to calm down a woman who's terrified of him. He's too late, but Kratos even tries to save a room full of women that are being attacked during the intro. This is where Kratos' Spartan side shows itself a few times during the game. Kratos tries to help women who can't fight for themselves, yet he routinely doesn't show any sympathy for men since he believes they're weak if they can't fend for themselves. This is probably the closest version of Kratos to his Norse game counterpart. The biggest difference here is Kratos' immaturity. As I said a minute ago, Kratos doesn't feel any remorse for his warlord ways yet. That won't show up until the Norse games. Kratos doesn't give a shit about who he hurts until he hurts someone that he cared about. To try and cope with his feelings of guilt and loss, he overindulges in sex and drinking. Once Ares is defeated, Athena reveals that Zeus and the gods had no intention of taking away his pain. With a play on words, they decide to simply forgive Kratos for his past alliance with Ares and the actions taken under his command. Realizing he was manipulated again by the gods is his final straw. The opening lines of the game are Kratos saying, "The gods of Olympus have abandoned me, now there is no hope." That was Kratos' last-ditch effort, relying on the gods to fix his mistakes. When he realizes this isn't happening, feeling like all hope is lost, he throws himself off of a cliff. Even this is taken from him as Athena lifts him back up to Mount Olympus. As far as he's concerned, Kratos is in a living nightmare. The gods won't take away his pain, and they won't let him do it himself either. Rewatch the scenes at the end of the game. When he finds out that the gods won't take away his memories, there's no outbursts, yelling, or threats of violence. Just a man who has no fight left in him. The scene of him sitting in the throne room for the first time isn't that of someone who's happy to be there either. Kratos just sits and slumps down, again accepting his new role because the gods won't let him do anything else. He spent his whole life fighting and conquering people weaker than himself, and now the roles are reversed. Kratos is the one being taken advantage of by a more powerful force. Throughout the entire game, and specifically at the end, Kratos is a broken man. Ironically, he gets all the power and more that he craved as a Spartan captain, but did so at the cost of his family and mental state. God of War 1 is a legit tragedy in terms of its narrative. People forget that killing Ares wasn't actually Kratos' end goal. Yes, he swears revenge, but there's not really anything he can actually do about it at the time. He serves the gods and completes their trials because he wants his PTSD taken away. Killing Ares just happens to be their final task, and it's only with their help that he's able to take down Ares. Everything seemingly works out for Kratos. He finishes the gods' tasks and kills Ares in the process, but is left worse off than before. Throughout part 1, Kratos is broken. Whether the writing was intentional or not, Kratos kinda follows the 7 stages of grief after his family's death. At least in the main trilogy. Again, the PSP titles in Ascension get a little wonky with the story. Depending on what source you're looking at for the 7 steps, they switch up the names, but it's all basically the same thing. Step 1 starts with shock. After Kratos takes in what happened, he's just kinda numb. This is someone who's seen countless deaths of enemies and allies alike, but this is different. At any stage of his character arc, when else would Kratos let an old oracle laugh at his misfortune, then cover him in his family's ashes while he barely even moves a step? For probably the first time in his life, Kratos can't really believe what he's just done. Then comes the next stage, denial. It's all Ares' fault, Kratos was tricked, and he never intended for this to happen. Swears revenge against Ares and starts trying to cope with booze and whores. Next comes the anger phase. This is where Kratos can't shake that one important detail that even if Ares put them in a city that was to be attacked, Kratos was still the one who committed the crime. This anger is pretty widespread and plants the seeds of Kratos in part 2. Kratos is angry at himself, and really, he's just angry in general over everything that led him to this point in his life. Doing the god's bidding also gives him a reason to fight and an outlet for that anger. Next comes bargaining. For normal people, this typically consists of self-inflection with a butterfly effect style of thinking, like, what could I have done differently, or what if so-and-so event never happened in the first place, would things be different? If it's from a religious person, then this is the stage that would also involve a lot of prayer and hopes that their god will fix things. For Kratos, it's a literal bargain with the Greek gods. This is where he can't take it anymore and asks them to help remove the memories of his family. Whatever they ask of him, he's ready for it because he can't live with himself anymore. Which leads to the 5th stage of depression. When he completes their tasks and finishes off Ares, Kratos expects the gods to hold up their end of the bargain and rid him of those memories. In his mind, that was the last-ditch effort. When that doesn't work, Kratos loses all hope and attempts to throw himself off a cliff. The second to last stage of acceptance is where we start God of War 2. In between parts 1 and 2, Kratos eventually tried to embrace his new role, but still found himself being considered an outsider by the other Olympians. He tried to be the god of war and act like one of them, but the opening cinematic tells us how they shunned him anyway. Look at the way Kratos interacts with his servants when he's still in the earlier stages of grief. After having a 3-way, he sits there with his head down, angry, ashamed, and still thinking about his past. The girls are also still in his bed and on his level. At the start of part 2, while Kratos is in the acceptance stage, he sits there confidently while the girls fawn over him, but this time at the bottom of his throne. But there are still cracks in the foundation of this acceptance stage. Kratos' still present depression and PTSD little by little resurface and turn back into anger and resentment. This is where Kratos hits the last stage of processing grief and moving forward. In the real world, this is supposed to be putting your past behind you and learning to live with and cope with your loss. Well, that's something that you can argue that Kratos still hasn't fully done even with the completion of Ragnarok. Right here, we're focused on specifically the death of his first family, and Kratos' way of moving forward with his life is to now embrace being the god of war. Be that Spartan captain again and be proud to be the one person whom everyone fears. Convince himself to go back to craving battle and conquest. This keeps growing until Kratos starts doing the exact same things that Ares was. Kratos reclaims his position in the Spartan army, but is now commanding them from Mount Olympus. Kratos never took action against Ares until the gods helped him because he knew it wasn't a fair fight while he was just a mortal warrior. Now, Kratos is a god too, and he's completely embraced that power. He knows he's on a level playing field with the rest of the Pantheon, and that goes to his head. Choosing to ignore advice from Athena, Kratos then descends down to join his army in attacking Rhodes. This is where Zeus has had enough. Zeus had actually already been afraid of Kratos' growing power and ego, which made him a potential threat. Mostly because of the cycle of family sabotage and releasing the negative emotions from Pandora's box being opened in part 1. Zeus overthrew his father Kronos, who overthrew his father before him too. When Kratos starts turning back into a conqueror and attacking cities like Ares was, this gives Zeus the excuse he needed to be rid of Kratos for good. Or at least that was the plan. Kratos might not have known the truth yet, but Zeus does still call Kratos his son right in the beginning of part 2. Could be a metaphorical way of talking, but I think it's Zeus still acknowledging he knows Kratos was his bastard kid. So, anyway, this is probably the stupidest version of Kratos throughout the entire series. You could argue that it's his ego and pride getting in the way, which isn't wrong, but it still leads to him doing some really stupid things. Athena just gets done warning him that Zeus is getting tired of his shit. Instead of listening, he immediately goes down and attacks Rhodes personally. Kratos gets some of his godly powers taken away and given to the now sentient Colossus, which he thinks is Athena's doing, not Zeus. When Zeus offers the Blade of Olympus his help, Kratos doesn't think draining his power into the blade is weird at all either. Kratos wins his fight, then gives a quick "look at how great I am" speech, and, in a complete slapstick-style move, is crushed by the falling Colossus' hand. Since his powers were drained into the blade, that hit damn near kills Kratos while he's in the middle of bragging. When Zeus shows up, Kratos even asks why Zeus would betray him, then proceeds to talk more shit about how Zeus is a weak ruler. In this sequence of events, Kratos is significantly overestimating himself and letting the acceptance of his power as god of war cloud his judgment. He's even given a second chance as long as he pledges his loyalty again, and Kratos instead challenges Zeus despite already being near death and reverting to immortal. There are two ways to look at this though. Kratos had to know what he was doing was stupid. It's more likely he felt like he had nothing left to lose, and this was nothing more than an essential kamikaze mission where he would take out as many people as he could, until if or when he was stopped. But I don't think it's that. I'm pretty sure he was just being dumb, angry, and overconfident. After Gaia convinces Kratos to fight his way back out of Hades, he immediately starts yelling at the Pegasus how he's the god of war and he needs to fight Zeus now. His anger and his ego have fully taken over at this point, and he's not thinking rationally anymore. This is that immaturity showing itself again. Kratos is so angry at Zeus that he wants to sprint right back into a fight that he cannot currently win. He lacks any kind of composure or planning, even though he just got his ass kicked and was sent to hell. God of War 2 Kratos is a very different character than the previous game. Whereas part 1 was about trying to rid himself of his PTSD, part 2 is where the revenge plot takes over. God of War 2 is very gameplay heavy throughout. After the intro, Kratos doesn't really get a ton of character development until the very end. We do see him start to rationalize and think a little more clearly when he encounters Theseus and Perseus though. Most people remember Kratos trying to spare Heimdall, Thor, and Baldur as character progression, but it's really in God of War 2 that Kratos actually started this trend. Kratos warns Theseus that if he lets him pass, there doesn't need to be a fight. When Perseus gives his monologue and starts to challenge Kratos, he doesn't say a word and only draws his blades when Perseus challenges him and starts attacking. But this is still the younger, now much angrier Kratos. The obvious difference being that Greek Kratos only gave one warning, whereas Norse Kratos tries to give a couple. When Theseus and Perseus don't stand down, there's no hesitation to killing them. In Kratos' mind, he gave them an out and they didn't take it. Whatever happens to them after that is their fault, not his. God of War 2 kinda paints Kratos in the same picture that the first game did. Kratos wasn't a good person, but Ares was worse. Now we know about how the gods repeatedly treated Kratos poorly, so even though he's being way more of a dick this time around, we still kinda get why he's doing it. Kratos is a shitty person, but so are the other gods. There's no right or wrong side. That is, until we get to the Palace of the Fates. Up until this moment, Kratos seems to only have a problem with Zeus. He didn't want to fight Theseus or Perseus, Icarus was batshit crazy and actually attacks him first, and Kratos manages to talk down Atlas rather than fight the Titan. Throughout the game, Kratos regains his composure and has made it clear that this is between him and Zeus. But he does take out some worshippers in the palace without much hesitation. When he burns a soldier in part 1, he mentions that it's the god's will. He's been tasked with killing Ares, and it was something he needed to do to fulfill that role. This time around, he's making these people read their last words and offering them as a sacrifice for his own gain and motivations. There is a bit of a difference. Everyone always mentions Kratos crushing that girl from Poseidon's chambers in Part 3 as a turning point for his character, but I feel like you can make the argument that it starts right here. They aren't women, but these aren't fighters either. These are normal people posing no threat to Kratos, and he still takes them out without a second thought, even telling them this is their purpose and to die with honor. The biggest difference here is that Kratos always had a softer spot for the women and children as opposed to any adult males, but Kratos is too blinded by his emotions to realize that he's slowly turning into exactly what he hated. This isn't him leading an army into battle and killing men from an opposing army or city. This is him killing for the sake of revenge and his personal agenda. Oddly enough, you stop a man from purposely jumping to his death in order to avoid you, only to then sacrifice him yourself. Don't know if they just wanted to add another puzzle in on that last book, or if this was meant to parallel Kratos' attempt at jumping off a cliff to then being killed by Zeus. But they do a good job of reeling you back in. Just when you start to think, shit, did Kratos really need to do that to these guys? Was there another way? They show Zeus attacking Sparta as punishment for Kratos' actions earlier. Now Zeus seems like the asshole again when the Spartans were just following orders. Zeus already killed everyone who was at Rhodes. The people currently living in Sparta had nothing to do with Kratos' attack on the city. This is just another step that drives Kratos further over the edge when he learns of Sparta's destruction. Either way, Kratos reaches the Sisters of Fate and succeeds in taking them all out and controlling time. I do love the callback that Ragnarok uses to describe this move.
When I challenged them, they threatened to undo my existence. So I killed them and turned their power on Zeus.
That's the most dangerous and irresponsible thing I've ever heard.
Kratos returns to the moment in time where Zeus turns on him and a fight ensues that Kratos actually wins. When he's about to finish off Zeus, Athena intervenes to save him and is accidentally stabbed by Kratos in the process. Throughout the entire game, this is the first time that we really see any shred of regret in Kratos. He's upset about accidentally killing another Spartan, but that immediately turns into anger after the quick, "you" remark. With Athena, he shows genuine regret right away and even sees her at the end of Part 3 in a section that also contains his family and Pandora. His relationship with Athena is a weird one. She's the only god that shows any support or care for Kratos, and he clearly didn't want to attack her. They don't seem like straight up allies, but there at least seems to be some sort of respect between the two. The remorse he has over her death turns back into anger though. Kratos' goal is to defeat Zeus, and that's what he's going to do. This is when he goes on a full heel turn. Athena's last words are letting him know that Zeus is his father, and killing Zeus will destroy all of Olympus. And Kratos doesn't give a shit. Kratos has no family, Zeus has destroyed all of Sparta, and the only god that he had some sort of a connection with is now dead because he accidentally stabbed her. Kratos officially has nothing left to lose, so he doesn't care at all about the collateral damage. Part 2 now starts and ends with Kratos not following warnings from Athena. After she dies, Kratos recruits the Titans and proudly claims that he's bringing the destruction of Olympus. If killing Zeus means the loss of life for thousands of innocent people, then that's what it is. Kratos now knows he's a god himself too. It wasn't just the aid from the other gods and Titans or the power of Pandora's box. He's able to recognize his own ability now as well. When it comes to the plot and characterization, God of War 2 doesn't really do a whole lot. In terms of character development, it's really a vessel to show Kratos has hit his point of no return. He goes a little crazy in the beginning, regains his composure throughout the game, but then commits himself to his goal at any cost. And now we finally get the God-Killer version of Kratos. The game opens up with the quote, "The measure of a man is what he does with power," and Kratos does a lot of brutal stuff with that power. As I said earlier, this is the version of Kratos that everyone remembers from the Greek games. Despite taking place back to back, Kratos has a much more threatening demeanor in Part 3. In Part 2, he was angry and impulsive. In Part 3, it's more of a controlled rage this time around. The game shows this off with the fight against Poseidon. Once Kratos knocks him out of the sea and onto the cliffs, he just beats the shit out of him. Switching the camera to Poseidon's viewpoint is almost like a scene from a horror movie, especially when he tries to crawl to the edge as Kratos calmly walks up to finish him off. Unfortunately for Kratos, Zeus takes down Gaia and knocks them both off Mount Olympus. Before he falls, Gaia reveals that Kratos was nothing more than a pawn to the Titans, something that Kratos won't forget. But I say that this is Kratos with more of a controlled rage because he's still able to have normal conversations with several characters. There were flashes of this in Part 2, but it was pretty short-lived as he was still riding that emotional roller coaster. In Part 3, Kratos uses his anger and quest for vengeance as more of a weapon, whereas Part 2 made him more brash and kinda stupider at times. Early on, Kratos stumbles upon Hephaestus and tries to get information about the Flame of Olympus out of him. Hephaestus lets him know that touching it will kill Kratos, but won't tell him where it is. Instead of threatening violence or acting on it, Kratos just walks away even though he could have beaten it out of him. But Kratos also knows that Hephaestus isn't exactly a big fan of Zeus either, so there might be a little bit of understanding between the two. Hephaestus and Pandora end up playing a really big part in Kratos' development. Poseidon, Hades, Hercules, Kronos, Helios, Hermes, basically everyone else we see stands in Kratos' way. Eventually Hephaestus does too, but it's for an entirely different reason than the rest. He seems more amused by Kratos' quest to kill Zeus until the realization sinks in that he intends to use Pandora as a way of putting out the Flame of Olympus. Kratos' interactions with Hephaestus and Pandora show that there is still a little bit of humanity left in Kratos, but it is very tough to find. Kratos has done everything in his power to try and push that down and only focus on defeating Zeus. In their second conversation, Hephaestus even tries to convince Kratos, one father to another, to bring Pandora back to him. Kratos refuses, but it does get a quick reaction out of him. Kratos is trying really hard to just push any of those old feelings out of his head. He now knows how much Pandora means to Hephaestus, yet in their third conversation, Kratos not so subtly hints at his plan to sacrifice her for his revenge, directly asking Hephaestus where he can find her. That's the equivalent of if Kratos in God of War 2018 nonchalantly asked Freya what Baldur's weakness was because he wanted to kill him. It's a cold-hearted move when you think about it. Besides the whole monster god-killer persona that Kratos has, he's far enough gone to ask and then tell Hephaestus that he's going to kill his daughter. And for good measure, the game gives you the option of banging his wife before this conversation too. This is the one person that I think, if Kratos had a redo, he would have spared Hephaestus even after he attacked Kratos. Later in Part 3, and then also telling a story in Ragnarok, Kratos brings up how Hephaestus died doing what every father should, protecting their child. But even with all that, in the moment, this wasn't enough to bring Kratos down from his mission to destroy Olympus, or even bring him back to reality a little bit as a person. Besides Hephaestus, we also see Kratos try and talk it out with Hercules. Where Hercules sounds sarcastic calling Kratos brother, it doesn't sound as condescending when Kratos returns the gesture. We get no backstory on their relationship, but this is another instance where Kratos genuinely seems like he didn't want to fight. Around these events, we get to see Kratos take out a few more of the Olympians and Titans, and it's all in pretty brutal fashion. Hades challenges Kratos only to be defeated, as well as having his soul ripped out for good measure. Gaia tries to ask for help, but is reminded of Kratos of her past statements before chopping off her hand, and, no pun intended, severing their partnership. Helios comes next. I kind of feel like Kratos wasn't letting him go regardless of if Helios truthfully answered any of his questions. He just wanted to try and get information out of him before literally taking his head off. Kratos knew about Helios' power and seemed kinda intent on getting it. Hermes I touched on earlier in terms of gameplay, but from a narrative angle, this is like serial killer Kratos here. We got a little taste of it when the camera shifted to Poseidon's view earlier, but now we get to see more of Kratos' viciousness. The whole encounter, Kratos only says one line to Hermes, and that's to reiterate that he's not worth the time to fight. Instead of a direct challenge, Hermes kinda just annoys Kratos too much, which eventually sparks the chase. When Kratos finally catches up, the looks on both the characters' faces explains it all. Hermes is shitting his pants, and Kratos is slowly climbing up after him, just looking to shut him up. I love this sequence though. Not for the gore, but for how Kratos reacts to everything. He started off with saying how Hermes wasn't worth the time, and after catching him, the game makes it clear that Kratos is barely even paying attention to what Hermes is saying. In the middle of it, Kratos just looks down at his boots and decides, I'm taking those. He gets one foot off, then, once again, slowly walks up and takes the other, like he's just going to work. It's Kratos being vicious without even trying. There's a lot of gory deaths in this game, but this is the one where Kratos is by far the most nonchalant about it. He doesn't see Hermes as a threat at all, so he doesn't take his threats seriously either. As Kratos says, Olympians always overestimate themselves. They all start confident until it's too late. Hercules and Hades are the only two who don't completely shit their pants before dying. And I guess Hera too, but she had more of beer muscles than anything else. Despite already being dead at the end of the game, even Athena has a moment of fear thinking Kratos was going to attack her again with the Blade of Olympus. In God of War 3, the game goes out of its way to make sure the player knows Kratos is in control of this situation. The Olympians and Titans talk a big game, but quickly realize their mistakes when it comes to blows. These are people who aren't used to being challenged or even really threatened. Then they all show real fear when Kratos comes along and has them completely outmatched. If you showed someone who has no understanding of the franchise some of the cutscenes, you wouldn't be wrong to assume that Kratos was the villain of the game, and that's arguably the strongest aspect of its storytelling. They make it obvious that what Kratos is doing is more than a bit excessive, and I love how they double down on it. The last hour or two makes it seem like Kratos is going to soften up when Pandora starts to remind him of his daughter. When she wants to throw herself into the flame of Olympus, Kratos does have a change of heart and decides there's gotta be another way. But of course Zeus shows up, and when push comes to shove, Kratos needs to decide between stopping Pandora from sacrificing herself or fighting Zeus. Kratos chooses fighting Zeus. There's no hesitation when it comes time to fully finish him off either. Kratos even discards his weapons so he can do the job with his bare hands. After everything that Kratos does throughout the series, I love how they give us a 5-second shot of Zeus realizing it's all over. When I just mentioned Kratos being in the position of power throughout the game and all the gods fearing him, Zeus's face right here says it all. As much as I love the game, I'm not huge on the ending. We see that quote about hope from Pandora like 10 times, and they make a big deal about Kratos releasing said hope, but I don't think he even did that on purpose. Kratos finally kills Zeus and destroys Olympus, but gets no satisfaction from it. While Athena has helped him quite a bit over the years, she clearly has her own agenda now too. I feel like Kratos trying to commit seppuku was one last fuck you to the gods and finally being able to do what he tried to at the start of the franchise. Like I said, just look at the background scenes. If Kratos really intended to give people hope and all that, do you think he would have destroyed 99% of the world first? I could be very wrong, and there could be interviews from the developers out there that confirm Kratos intended to release hope, but that still doesn't have it make much sense to me. I interpret this as Kratos trying to take everyone down with him. But Kratos is tough to kill, and that massive torso wound doesn't keep him down for long. There's a lot of theories as to why Kratos doesn't die here, and honestly, I have no clue which is correct. All I know is that across all the games, different gods are shown in both cutscenes and gameplay to take terrible wounds and shrug it off somewhat easily. For the most part, it seems like unless it's breaking necks, choking someone out, or really just head and neck injuries in general, the gods are extremely durable when it comes to flesh wounds. After Kratos realizes he isn't dying there, he drags himself away from what's left of Greece and arrives in Scandinavia. Norse Kratos is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to his personality. He's trying really hard to be what he believes is a better person, and as a result, he's all over the place while he struggles with this, especially in 2018. Sometimes he shows genuine growth and empathetic qualities, but also spends a lot of the game lying to Atreus, and despite saying he no longer has anything to hide, still hiding a ton of his past. Saying he killed people who were not deserving is true, but it's a pretty massive understatement. That's like saying that World War II was just a cultural disagreement. Kratos destroyed an entire continent, or country, or some type of landmass full of people. They never really explain how the geography works. Admitting he killed Zeus is a nice first step, but he fails to mention how he also killed a whole family of half-brothers and in-laws too. Not to mention the elephant in the room of why his skin is completely white, that he only admits to Freya. I didn't expect all that to come out in 2018 since Atreus is still pretty young and doesn't understand what being a god entails, but I got the feeling that he never really gets into it further with Atreus through Ragnarok either. When Atreus keeps insisting on going to Asgard and poking the beehive when it comes to Odin and war, I kept waiting for Kratos to sit him down and be like, dude, you have no clue what it's like to deal with gods this powerful. Here's what happened to me, and shit got crazy. Mimir knew about the Ghost of Sparta legend, and Thor says it too, which means Odin definitely knows. It seems like Atreus should probably need to know as well. Instead, it's just overprotective Kratos and belligerent, won't listen to reason Atreus. While most people praise their relationship, I thought it was a little frustrating to sit through at times, but it makes sense from a narrative perspective. Kratos is really bipolar in how he treats Atreus in 2018 because he has no clue what he's doing as a parent, he's still upset about Faye, and he's trying really hard to keep his anger under control. Kratos in God of War 2018 isn't just struggling as a father, he's struggling to just be a normal person. Atreus is just boy, Mimir is just head, and Freya is addressed as woman half the time, and he frequently altogether ignores other characters when he's spoken to. Hell, except for the story about Atreus of Sparta at the end, I feel like there's only a handful of times throughout the whole game where Kratos says sentences that have more than like 6 or 7 words. He isn't even comfortable having simple interactions with people again. Atreus says that Kratos was never around during his childhood, and the game simply explains that he was out hunting. Comics and novelizations expand on it and say that Kratos would leave for long periods of time because he was out teaching himself how to fight and live without losing control of his emotions, namely his anger issues. Which kind of works. 2018 Kratos is a lot more like the Greek games than I think people give credit. When he initially fights Baldur, Kratos definitely still has the look of his Greek counterpart. He gives his warnings, but then it's the way he looks back twice to make sure Atreus isn't watching that's the most telling part. Even before he knew that Baldur was dangerous, it gives off the vibe that Kratos isn't messing around here and planned on killing Baldur regardless. When he does realize the situation, it's back to snapping necks. When Magni shows up, there's no warning, it's just a kill shot when he gets the chance. When Baldur is vulnerable, it's Atreus that has to talk him out of finishing the job. 2018's Kratos might not be anywhere near as far gone as he was in Part 3, but this is still a relatively hot-headed Kratos. For both of the Norse games, there's been a debate about just how strong Kratos is. Multiple characters mock him for being old, Thor says it's a lesser version of himself, and Freya is confident that she can defeat Kratos despite him not fighting back against her several times. I think it's pretty obvious that Kratos is holding himself back. He's afraid of losing control and turning into the Ghost of Sparta god killer again. I'd argue that he's just as strong, if not stronger now, than he was in God of War 3. He just needs the motivation. Look at the situations I just mentioned. When he initially warns and then tries to kill Baldur, he's currently checking to make sure Atreus isn't watching. It's with the purpose of protecting him, and also eliminating a threat that seemingly knows Kratos' past that he's been hell-bent on keeping a secret. When he overpowers and kills Magni, it's because Atreus tries to attack Modi head-on and needs saving. A little later, Modi has Kratos pinned down until Atreus falls unconscious, then Kratos overpowers him. At the Jotunheim Gate, Baldur is kicking Kratos' ass and just impaled him with a pretty big rock. It's only when Baldur says he's been looking for Atreus the whole time that Kratos gets his second wind to keep fighting. Whereas the Greek games revolve around Kratos' PTSD of his first family, the Norse games take it a step further, and it's about Kratos literally being afraid of himself. Being afraid of people, namely Atreus, learning of what he's done before and what damage he's truly capable of still doing. This fear of himself shuts Kratos down at times in 2018. It's why one scene he goes from being very short and blunt, or just outright completely ignoring people, to then attempting to give fatherly advice in the next scene. How he goes from being too harsh on Atreus one minute, to then not knowing how to show emotion the next. Fighting and brutality is what he knows, and it's always what he falls back on. Kratos was more comfortable going into Helheim, killing the Guardian, and ripping out its heart, than he was just having a conversation with Atreus. When Kratos apologizes in Ragnarok and the two have a heart-to-heart about their flaws, this is what Kratos means when he says he pushes Atreus away. Throughout both games, Kratos is too stubborn about his ways and believes he never has to explain himself, but still expects full obedience. It's really not until the time skip between 2018 and Ragnarok that Kratos slowly learns to be more of a normal person. Ragnarok Kratos is by far the most well-adjusted version of the character throughout the series, but that doesn't mean he's cured of all his mental baggage either. Not by a long shot. In God of War 2018, Kratos was basically trying to change himself through brute force of will. That's what he's always done, just in the opposite direction. For example, when he found out that killing Zeus would also destroy Olympus, he forced himself to shut out any doubt about his mission. Now he's trying the same strategy, but in a bit more of a positive manner. He's continued to get closer with Atreus, and the character seems genuinely happy at times. Even stopped calling Mimir head and formed a true friendship with him. He doesn't talk in those abrupt, almost broken English kinds of sentences anymore, and can actually express himself with something other than anger. This is the life that Kratos wanted when he says he came to Midgard to live as a normal man. Only problem is that this makes him really selfish. It's completely unintentional on his part, but it's still there. In 2018, the biggest conflict of the narrative was Kratos fighting with himself internally and thinking his past followed him. In Ragnarok, that main conflict now comes from Kratos and Atreus pushing back against one another. Odin is the main villain, but he's more of an obstacle for them to overcome. Kratos and Atreus' relationship and the actions they take as a result tends to move the narrative along more than Odin himself does. In 2018, Atreus was too young to really know any better. When tempers flared between the two, he would eventually relent and ease up on being a dick because Kratos was the dad and he was just boy. In Ragnarok, he's older, overconfident, and can't take Kratos' new overbearing ways of fatherhood. Kratos pulls a pretty hard 180. He goes from rarely being around and letting Faye do all the parenting, to now wanting to control Atreus' life. It's very easy to get annoyed at Atreus' decisions throughout the game, but Kratos keeps freaking out about trust and Atreus hiding things, when Kratos is still hiding so many things about himself at the same time. Kratos is well past his days of rushing into battle with no plan, and he thinks that's exactly what Atreus is doing with Odin. Doing that in the past has gotten Kratos killed a couple times, and he knows that Atreus isn't anywhere near the same caliber fighter that he is. The last thing he wants to watch is Atreus pick a fight with Asgard. Atreus, who's now experiencing the rush of his own godly powers, is still too young and naive to know any better. All he knows is that Kratos has killed gods before. Atreus watched him kill Magni, Balder, and a dragon, along with taking out all the Valkyries. This is where Atreus gets overconfident. Notice how that's always a trend with the gods at some point? Atreus mistakes being there and taking part in the fights as his own accomplishments. He kinda thinks he's untouchable, and after their exploits so far, doesn't really have good reason to fear death or injury. Atreus just doesn't have the experience to understand the true power of Asgard and the people he's fucking around with. He's too blinded by the Ragnarok prophecy and the plan Faye set up to see the danger in it. He's too focused on the whole champion of Jotnar thing to remember that Kratos has been the one doing the vast majority of the heavy lifting in fights. Rather than look at how poorly all his decisions could go, Atreus chooses to somewhat hide behind the prophecy that Loki is supposed to usher in Ragnarok. And none of this is okay with Kratos. Rather than explain his past, all of his past, he chooses to keep raising Atreus in a do as I say, not as I do style of parenting, and Atreus knows that it's bullshit. I talked about Hephaestus for a bit earlier in God of War 3, and it's a good example now. Kratos tries to tell Atreus the story about Hephaestus and Pandora to make him feel better. The notable part of this is that Kratos frames it as just a story he's heard. He purposely leaves out the part where he was the guy trying to sacrifice Pandora, and then he was also the person who killed the blacksmith. It changes the context of his story a little bit. This is where Kratos still completely fails in his growth as a father and person. He's still too ashamed of his past to be honest with Atreus, but he spends a lot of the game complaining about trust issues between the two of them. Much like Atreus' overconfidence stems from not knowing any better, Kratos has come a very long way in his own right, so he doesn't understand how much further he still has to go emotionally as well. It's a big moment later on in the game when Kratos admits that leaving out emotion and thinking from battle might not be a good thing. Kratos always did this because he was never fighting for anything good. As a Spartan, he fought to conquer. After that, he fought what the gods told him to fight. Lastly, destroying Greece for his own selfish reasons. Kratos always had to take emotion out of the equation because that would leave him with self-doubt or would slow him down to actually think about the consequences. He had his goals and he needed to focus on only the end result, not how he got there. Ironically, that's what killed his first family, going into a rage the second he entered that temple and not even looking at who he was attacking. You would think Kratos would learn from that, but he just doubled down each game. Basically the entirety of parts 2 and 3, he doesn't think anything through. He's only worried with the end goal of killing Zeus, and whatever happens along the way of this end goal isn't his concern. He still had the same view in 2018 when it comes to hiding his godhood from Atreus. He doesn't give a shit what detriment it has on Atreus' health or their relationship, he just knows that he vowed to never tell him. Mimir and Freya both try to warn Kratos multiple times of the damage he's doing, and it falls on deaf ears. It's only when Atreus says he knows Kratos never wanted him that he breaks his selfishness for a second. When he finally does tell Atreus the truth, he leaves out massive chunks of information on the subject. Kratos later saying, "Open your heart to your emotions," is a really big deal for him as a character. Even when Kratos had good intentions, those intentions are usually still aligned with his own selfishness. He wants to save Pandora, but doesn't stop her until the two are directly in front of the Flame of Olympus, then lets her go to fight Zeus anyway. Time and time again, we've seen Kratos apologize for killing his family and says he'd give up anything to take it back, but when he can control time, his quest for revenge takes precedent and he goes right back to Zeus. He'd rather use the Blades of Chaos again and willingly go into Helheim to heal Atreus, but still never had any intention of telling his son the truth, despite seeing it almost kill him this time around. Even when he means well, Kratos is still an extremely selfish character. When people say that Kratos has been neutered in Ragnarok, it's because they aren't used to seeing a version of Kratos that isn't as selfish or shows mercy during a fight. Around the middle of the game, Kratos is actively trying to not be that selfish character. There's been criticism that he lost his backbone, but it's really Kratos trying harder than ever to not be the piece of shit that he usually is. He's finally acknowledging that he's lived a really bad life. It's why he's so distant with everyone. He's completely ashamed of his life in Greece, and most importantly, ashamed that person might still be inside of him. I mentioned how God of War 2018 has Kratos fight harder when Atreus is threatened. It's clearly because Kratos wants to keep him safe, and that lets his anger come back out. When he's fighting Thor, it's not subtle. Thor blatantly says over and over that Kratos is holding back. The whole time he's goading Kratos into losing his temper and making him fight like he's capable of. Without getting too off subject, in the mythology, Thor was known for his overindulgences on everything. It's why he's a fat drunk in Ragnarok. Thor loved food and drinking, but he also loved fighting and anything competitive. Thor really wanted to see the god-killer version of Kratos, and he finally sees it when his last insult is mentioning that Odin has plans for Atreus. All their back and forths and 3 stages of the fight, Kratos doesn't really hit him until Atreus' safety is mentioned. In that scene, after he punches Thor, I don't think Kratos looks angry there. He doesn't follow up with another attack, he's half screaming, half breathing heavy, and kinda just slowly looks over at Thor. After that punch, Kratos looks like someone that's a little scared. Even in the middle of a fight with arguably the most powerful person he's ever faced, Kratos is actively trying to keep himself under control at all times, and he was just about to lose that control. In his lore entry about Thor, Kratos even says that it was good for both of them that the fight ended prematurely. By this, Kratos means he was indeed about to lose control, and likely feels like he would have killed Thor right there, even though he really didn't want to. Kratos is that afraid of falling back into his old ways, and it's not the only time we'll see it. There's 2 scenes that stand out. First being when Odin pops in to taunt Kratos after he gets the new spear. Odin begins the conversation by making it clear that Atreus is safe as long as he returns to Asgard safe as well. It's Odin's way of having the upper hand from the start and giving Kratos a good reason to stay calm. While fighting Thor in the beginning, Kratos isn't exactly having a full conversation with him, but he is giving normal responses and even trying to talk down Thor here and there. In this scene with Odin, Kratos reverts back to his 2018 style of silence, followed by short, blunt responses. Kratos isn't stupid. Just like in the beginning of the game, he knows this is an open threat from Odin, and not an actual conversation. During the intro, Kratos only says no in response to Odin, in hopes of calling his bluff. Back then, Kratos didn't want a fight. This time, Kratos returns the threat by assuring Odin that the God Killer is still in there if Atreus is hurt. Odin throws a couple more threats out there because he knows he currently still has the upper hand, but Kratos made his intentions very clear as well. If anything happens to Atreus, expect to see the same guy who destroyed Olympus. I kinda wish we got to see a little bit more of that chess match between Odin and Kratos. At least the real Odin, not Kratos thinking it was really Tyr. The second time is the end of the fight against Heimdall. Real quick, there seems to be some misconceptions around Heimdall's abilities. Most people assume he calls Kratos a monster because he's reading his memories as he's being choked. Heimdall can't read memories, he can read minds. What he has is foresight, or intuition as Kratos calls it in the lore entry, and there is a big difference. When Odin says Heimdall reads minds, he means that Heimdall can read a person's intent, meaning their present thoughts, which can lead to potential future actions. This is how he can react so quickly in battle, because he knows what a person is going to do before they physically do it. It's still on him to keep his cool and react properly, though. It's kind of like the God of War version of Spider-Man's Spider Sense. This ability notifies Heimdall of danger, but he still has to adjust correctly to it. The foresight can be overcome if he doesn't react to it appropriately, or is simply fighting an opponent that's just got him completely outmatched. The obvious advantage here is that Heimdall is a god, so he has godly reflexes, strength, durability, and the manipulation of the Bifrost. There's very few people who can match him with just those powers, let alone with the foresight ability added in. But Heimdall can be beat. This is why he backs down from Thor when the two are having a pissing match in Asgard. He looks into Thor's eyes and sees what Thor is currently thinking. Whatever it is, Heimdall didn't like it. He literally asks, "What would you do to stop me?" then backs down when he gets an answer by reading Thor's intentions. Heimdall is openly admitting that Thor would have stopped him from further antagonizing Atreus, and calls him a sick man for it. This is important because it's outright showing us that Heimdall isn't impossible to beat. Just because he claims no one has hit him in centuries or however long it was, doesn't mean it's impossible to do so, just that he hasn't fought anyone who is capable of doing it in that time frame. Kratos also flat out says he's beaten better gods than Heimdall, acknowledging that the foresight is really the biggest advantage rather than pure skill. So, now that we've discussed what his foresight does, back on topic. This means that when Kratos is choking him, Heimdall is reading Kratos' current thoughts. He's reading Kratos' mind as he is squeezing the life from another god. If he saw noble intentions, he wouldn't be calling Kratos a monster. Noble intentions would be Kratos doing this to protect Atreus, which is how the conflict initially starts. Kratos first has him beat and blows up one of his arms as a way to try and end the fight without anyone dying. When Kratos spares him, Heimdall reads that he has no intention of actually killing him, which also happens to be a huge insult to Aesir that are trying to get to Valhalla through falling in battle. During that sequence, Heimdall wasn't reading thoughts of violence or malice. He doesn't currently see Kratos as a monster. He was reading the thoughts of a man that pitied him. When Kratos has had enough and goes for the kill, his own intentions have changed. The god killer of the Greek trilogy shows himself again. Heimdall has been fully beaten again this time, but Kratos doesn't care anymore. He's pissed off and he lets himself lose control. Heimdall calls Kratos a monster because he's seeing a side of Kratos that's enjoying killing another god again. Heimdall is seeing something completely different in Kratos' eyes than he saw a few minutes ago. Kratos isn't just fighting to protect Atreus anymore, he's finishing off Heimdall because he wants to. Mimir tries to yell and stop him, but Kratos doesn't even acknowledge it. As the camera pans away from Heimdall and back to Kratos' face, you can see him snap back to reality after he lets go. When Mimir tries to talk to him afterwards, Kratos just grunts and remains silent. It's brief, but Kratos loses control in that moment. In that same lore entry about Heimdall, Kratos admits that he wouldn't accept mercy, so killing him wasn't completely by choice, but does admit that it was satisfying to do so. That's exactly what Kratos is afraid of, still hiding inside himself. When he loses control and gets a sense of satisfaction out of taking another life. By being able to read people's current thoughts, Heimdall sees the worst in everyone, every day of his life. You can't hide anything from him, and that's half the reason why he's so jaded and pompous. He routinely sees the worst thoughts of both humans and gods. While Kratos was choking Heimdall, Kratos was enjoying doing it, and that's why Heimdall calls him a monster. You hear the line "be better" said over and over throughout the entire game, but that's Kratos' arc through Ragnarok. Trying to force himself to be better in every aspect of his life. Continuing to accept his past and trying not to make the same mistakes over and over again. But I do like how they have Kratos screw up while doing that. Yeah, there's definitely times the be better thing gets more than a little heavy-handed when telling this narrative, but it wouldn't make sense for Kratos to make this transition seamlessly into being a complete good guy and great father without struggling along the way. For the majority of the series, Kratos is a piece of shit, and at his worst, is probably worse than the gods he hates so much. I think that's why I liked the very end scene so much. Kratos sees the final panel of himself as being worshipped, and it hits him pretty hard. Even tells Mimir and Freya he saw a path he never imagined was possible. What he says is a nice callback to both Zeus and Odin too. When Kratos stops Baldur from hurting Freya, he says the cycle ends here, which Zeus also says to Kratos when he initially killed him in Part 2. At the end of Part 3, when Zeus is surveying all the damage that Kratos has done, he says how he will have much to do when he's done fighting. When Freya asks Kratos what's next at the end of Ragnarok, he says there is much to do, much to rebuild. Kratos wants to rebuild Scandinavia just like Zeus intended to rebuild Greece. Even if the Greek gods were horrible people too, the general population didn't really know that. Zeus did keep a peaceful rule for a long time, and his people had faith in the gods. Hell, Kratos himself even had faith in the gods during Part 1. This is where what Odin says to him about being worshipped comes into play too. People like to bring up that the Spartans have worshipped Kratos, but they're kinda missing the point. The Spartans didn't as much worship Kratos as they relied on him to watch over them during war. And that's just the Spartans. Greece didn't worship Kratos by any means. It's the opposite. We're frequently told that most of Greece was terrified of him. Everyone knew about the Ghost of Sparta legend, and they show both gods and mortals being afraid of Kratos. That's not exactly being worshipped. The other part is when Odin says, "What do you even know of godhood?" And he's right. Kratos hasn't exactly been the most responsible god with his powers. This is where Kratos has his moment of realization. Everything up to this point is what he's been training for. Right now, he has a genuine second chance. He can rebuild, and he can be a just god that's worshipped for the right reasons. It doesn't change what he's done in the past, but Kratos finally realizes that he can still do a lot of good going forward and rewrite what's left of his legend, and that's an awesome ending to his character arc. With all that said, where does Kratos go from here now? With the huge success of both Norse games, I can't see any situation where they end the franchise here. I do feel like they wrote themselves into a little bit of a corner with the end of Ragnarok, though. It's an extremely satisfying ending for Kratos, but it does feel more like a true ending to his character, rather than just a, for now, in-game ending. Unless they really switch some stuff up, Ragnarok is basically the end of Norse mythology. Not all the gods die during Ragnarok, but after that, life just kinda goes on with the surviving humans repopulating the world. There isn't much else of note from what I've read. Which means there isn't really a whole lot left for Kratos to do here after Odin is defeated. You could always have him go around rebuilding the realms, but you're getting dangerously close to the issue that the Greek games had after God of War 3. We know how the story with Odin, Thor, and all the real threats ends, so it makes whatever conflict Kratos still has in the Nine Realms seem anticlimactic. There are a lot of different ways to handle this though. First up, and the most likely scenario, they try to hand the franchise off to Atreus. Whatever the next narrative is, there's a pretty good chance they go forward with Atreus, Angerboda, and Thrud leading the way. At least for the first game. I could see Kratos then coming to the rescue in a sequel. It's the easiest way to kickstart his character arc back up again. The Norse games are very open about other regions not only existing, but also having direct contact with each other. The Norse gods knew about the Ghost of Sparta story, while Tyr was shown to have traveled between different regions. Hell, Mimir isn't even originally from the Scandinavia region either. There seems to be no shortage of options for the next plot. The Norse games were originally developed to take place in Egypt, so that seems like the most likely next step, but Celtic, Japanese, and Mayan cultures have all been referenced too. Other gods could try to invade if they hear about Odin's defeat. Atreus and his friends could accidentally cause trouble in another realm while looking for giants. There could easily be a connection between Athena, the mask, and Odin's knowledge rift, or even Sindri could screw something up while he's still mourning Brock. With his current mental state, I doubt he'd be too fond of Kratos taking over as the new leader, and his dwarven magic seems to be pretty good at unlocking realm travel, which could lead to regions mixing together. If the situation gets bad enough, who knows? Maybe we could even see the God Killer Kratos to the rescue, since Ragnarok dropped a couple hints of that side still existing within Kratos. But yeah, they have plenty of options on incorporating a new mythology into the picture, but I do get the feeling that, at least for one game, Kratos probably takes a backseat to Atreus to start the next series. So this video is finally over with, and sorry it took quite a while to make. Originally this was just going to be about Ragnarok, but I kept hitting roadblocks while writing out that script, so it turned into this big ass thing somehow. But if you're still here, thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed it if you sat through this whole thing. You guys know all about the like, comment, and subscribe stuff. Do so if you give a shit, obviously it always helps the channel. Speaking of which, there's a couple thousand subscribers now, which is pretty awesome. So I guess here's a quick update for anyone interested. Next video is probably going to be on Cyberpunk. I actually had a video really close to being done, but I don't know, I just wasn't happy with the way it turned out when I was close to uploading it, so I scrapped the whole thing. Then Ragnarok came out and it got put on the back burner. So I gotta replay it to get the game capture again and tweak what I didn't like about the script, but the bones are still in place, so hopefully that shouldn't take too long if I decide to give it another go, which I probably will because I had a lot of fun playing Cyberpunk, even with all its flaws. Either way, I'm also going to assume I'll have something out on the Resident Evil 4 Remake too, because the original is one of my all-time favorites, and this remake is looking great. So, one last time, thanks again for checking this out, hope you liked it, and that's all I've got for now. See you guys.